It was just another regular flight from New York to London, cruising at 35,000 feet with a smooth and clear sky. The passengers were settling in, some were sleeping, others were quietly reading or watching movies on their screens. The hum of the plane's engines provided a soothing backdrop to the otherwise peaceful cabin. Captain Richard Holloway, an experienced pilot with over 20 years in the air, sat calmly in the cockpit, scanning his instruments. His co-pilot, Olivia Turner, was equally focused, flipping through her flight notes for any potential turbulence ahead. Both pilots were confident, accustomed to the routine of long-haul flights. But today, something was different. At first, it was a faint fluttering sound, barely perceptible. Holloway glanced up, a little puzzled, but the noise quickly faded into the steady hum of the engines. He didn't think much of it. Yet, within minutes, the sound returned, this time louder and more persistent. It was a rhythmic tapping against the plane, as though something was repeatedly hitting the fuselage. Holloway adjusted his headset and looked out of the cockpit window, expecting to see something, perhaps an aircraft or an unusual cloud formation. To his surprise, nothing was in sight. The sky was clear. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something peculiar. A flock of crows soaring close to the plane. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, a small group of birds passing by at high speed. But then more appeared. The crows circled around the plane, their dark figures growing larger with each pass. Holloway raised an eyebrow and exchanged a look with Olivia, who was now peering out the side window with a frown. The birds were getting closer, coming perilously close to the wings. "That's strange," Olivia muttered, adjusting her controls to keep the plane steady. Holloway radioed the flight control tower. "New York, this is Flight 742. We've got an odd situation up here. A large group of crows seems to be circling the plane. Any other planes in the area?" "Flight 742, we copy. Negative on other aircraft in your vicinity." The air traffic controller responded, sounding equally puzzled. "Keep us updated, Captain. Just keep a safe distance from the birds." Holloway looked again at the crows. They weren't just flying near the plane. They were actively pursuing it. There were dozens now, diving at the plane's wings and occasionally flapping so close to the windows that Holloway could almost hear their sharp calls through the glass. It was as if the birds had no fear, no sense of the danger in their pursuit. "They're not backing off," Olivia remarked, her voice tense now. "This is not normal." The flight attendants, noticing the change in the cabin atmosphere, began to look concerned as well. Passengers glanced nervously out the windows, seeing the crows as they swooped and darted in coordinated movements. Some of the more perceptive passengers murmured amongst themselves, wondering if the birds were a sign of something ominous. As the crows continued their relentless pursuit, the plane's delicate balance started to shift. The aircraft seemed to vibrate with each impact of the bird's wings against the fuselage. Holloway gripped the controls a little tighter. "Olivia, keep monitoring the altitude and the autopilot. I'll take a closer look." The situation was growing more unusual by the second. The crows were no longer just circling. Some were even colliding with the plane's exterior, leaving streaks of dark feathers in their wake. Holloway felt a pang of discomfort in his gut. It was an instinct. Something was wrong. The tapping on the windows, the persistent flapping of wings, the crow's relentless pursuit. None of it made any sense. What could be drawing them so fiercely toward the plane? What was it that was compelling these birds to attack in such a strange and unnatural way? "New York, this is Flight 742, Holloway said again, his voice a little firmer now. "We need to get some answers. The birds aren't letting up, and we need advice on how to proceed." There was a brief silence on the other end before the air traffic controller spoke again. Flight 742, we've never had a situation quite like this before. Stand by for further instructions. But as Holloway and Olivia stared at the relentless swarm of crows outside their cockpit window, they knew one thing for sure. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was becoming more dangerous by the minute. The relentless tapping against the fuselage grew louder with each passing minute. What had started as a few curious crows circling the plane had now escalated into a full-fledged assault. Holloway's knuckles whitened as he gripped the controls, his eyes darting nervously between the instruments and the window. He could see them clearly now, dozens, maybe even hundreds, of crows, all swirling around the aircraft in a disorienting frenzy. The birds didn't simply pass by. They darted, swooped, and banked with a coordinated precision that seemed almost deliberate. Holloway had flown through storms, turbulence, and even bird strikes before, but never had he experienced anything like this. The crows weren't simply flying alongside them. They were actively engaging with the plane, crashing against it as if they were trying to get inside. Olivia's voice cut through the tense silence in the cockpit. "Captain, look at the radar." Holloway turned his attention to the screen. The radar was flashing an alarming series of red and yellow blips, indicating the presence of something directly in the plane's path. But this wasn't a plane or weather pattern. It was the crows. They were so close to the plane that they were interfering with the radar signals. It was as though the birds were not just following them, but were somehow interacting with the very technology designed to keep them safe. "I've never seen anything like this," Holloway muttered, eyes narrowing. He glanced at the altitude readout, ensuring that they weren't veering off course, but the crow's proximity was causing a ripple effect. The pressure outside the plane felt different, more intense. The sound of wings flapping against the metal had now become a constant drone, like an eerie buzzing in the background. The cabin was now filled with the anxious murmurs of the passengers. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain calm, but even they couldn't hide the unease in their voices as they passed through the aisles. Some passengers had moved to the windows, staring in confusion at the swarm of crows that seemed to multiply the longer the flight went on. Others clutched armrests or whispered nervously to each other, wondering if this was a sign of something far worse. The cockpit door opened briefly as one of the flight attendants stepped in, her face pale. "Captain, passengers are getting restless. Some of them are asking if it's safe to continue the flight." Holloway glanced at Olivia, who was tapping frantically at the controls, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. He could feel his heart rate quickening. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a full-on threat. He stood up and walked over to the window, trying to spot any sign of the birds pulling back, but there was no sign of them relenting. They were everywhere now, their black silhouettes filling the sky as far as the eye could see. The crows swooped closer, brushing against the plane's wings, and Holloway flinched as one bird struck the fuselage with a sickening thud. "Olivia, we need to get these birds away from the plane," he said, voice steady but with an underlying edge of concern. "Start checking the emergency protocols. If we can't shake them off, we may have to divert." Olivia quickly scanned through the flight manual. "I'm not finding anything on this. I mean, bird strikes are one thing, but this is different. We've got some kind of avian assault going on, and I don't know how to stop it." Holloway sat back down, his mind racing. He tried to recall any procedure for situations like this, something to address an unnatural bird attack, or at least something to explain why they weren't leaving. But there was nothing. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. Meanwhile, the passengers continued to grow more anxious. A few were standing in the aisles now, peering out the windows with wide eyes. One elderly woman began to cry, clutching her seatbelt and asking aloud if they were going to crash. A man sitting by the window shouted, pointing out at the flock of birds. "Look, they're not stopping. Why aren't they leaving?" Olivia's eyes widened as she watched the birds through the cockpit's side window. "Captain, they're getting bolder. Some of them are almost ramming the engines." Holloway's heart skipped a beat. He immediately flicked the switch to activate the plane's external cameras, looking at the wingtip. Sure enough, a group of crows was now diving straight at the engines, flapping violently, making contact with the engine casing with alarming frequency. The windscreen wipers struggled to clear the mess of feathers, but it was no use. The birds were relentless. "New York, this is Flight 742. We've got a serious problem up here. The birds are aggressively attacking the plane. We need to know if there's any way to break free of this swarm or if we should consider an emergency landing," Holloway radioed, his voice now laced with urgency. There was a long pause before the air traffic controller replied. "Flight 742, we've never encountered anything like this. The crows, they seem to be following you. We're checking any reports of unusual activity at your location. Stand by." As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. Holloway could feel the plane shaking slightly, as if the crow's assault was having an impact on the aircraft's stability. The sound of their wings beating against the metal hull was deafening now, almost as if the crows were trying to communicate, to force their way inside. And then, as if in response to the growing tension, the birds began to swarm in closer, diving at the cockpit windows. Holloway's heart raced as a few of the crows struck the glass, cracking it slightly, but not enough to compromise the integrity of the cockpit. The moment had become too real. Whatever was happening, whatever had caused the birds to behave this way, it was escalating, and they were running out of time. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. The relentless assault of the crows on the plane had reached a level that no one could have anticipated. Holloway could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the incessant tapping and thumping of the birds grew louder. They were no longer just flapping around the fuselage. They were attacking with a focused, almost predatory aggression. Every minute that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. The cockpit was filled with the sound of crows' wings crashing against the metal hull, the occasional screech piercing through the air. Holloway wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, then turned to Olivia. "Olivia, we need to figure out what's going on here," he said, his voice tinged with frustration and urgency. "This is beyond a normal bird strike. Something's driving them to behave like this. It's as if they're targeting us." Olivia, who had been toggling switches and scanning the radar for any sign of another aircraft, nodded. She was looking pale, her usual confidence shaken by the unnerving nature of the situation. "I agree. I've never seen birds this aggressive. It's almost like they're being drawn to us. It doesn't make any sense." The two pilots stared out the cockpit window, watching the relentless swarm of crows. There was no sign of the birds letting up. They were so close to the plane now that it was hard to see the sky. The black shapes pressed against the windows, occasionally scraping the glass with their beaks and claws. The plane had become a target, a vessel under siege by nature itself. Holloway took a deep breath. "We need to investigate further. If we don't find out what's causing this, we might not make it out of this situation." Olivia nodded again, her fingers now dancing over the flight control panel as she ran through the onboard systems. She checked the autopilot, then the aircraft's communication systems, and quickly glanced at the engine status. Everything's functioning normally, she said after a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. There are no mechanical issues, but there's something off about this situation. It's not just birds. It's like they're being drawn to something. We need to figure out what. Holloway was already a step ahead. Let's take a closer look at the cargo hold. Maybe something's triggering their behavior. They had flown thousands of miles and dealt with their fair share of challenges. But this was different. This felt like something much larger than a freak bird encounter. Holloway made the decision to investigate the aircraft's interior and cargo hold, certain that whatever was affecting the birds might also be the key to solving their problems. He grabbed the intercom and spoke directly to the cabin crew. "This is Captain Holloway. We're going to check something in the cargo hold. Please ensure that passengers remain seated with their seatbelts fastened and stay calm." The voice of the flight attendant crackled through. "Understood, Captain. We'll keep them informed." As Holloway moved to stand up, Olivia's eyes flicked toward the cockpit window again. "Captain, there's something odd. Look." He followed her gaze to the flight controls. She was pointing to a small but steady blip that appeared on the radar. Nothing big enough to pose a threat, but it was unusual. It wasn't another plane or any recognized weather pattern. "This must be the crows," Holloway said. "They're disrupting the radar. We're going to have to rely on visual cues." He opened the cockpit door and led the way down the narrow aisle toward the rear of the plane. The flight attendants had already secured the passengers, who were growing restless as the strange events unfolded. Holloway moved through the cabin quickly, trying to keep his own nerves in check. The air felt tense, almost suffocating, as the sounds of the crows outside the plane continued to hammer relentlessly against the structure. Arriving at the rear, Holloway opened the hatch that led to the cargo hold. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. Suitcases, equipment, and supplies stacked neatly. But as he took a few steps forward, he noticed something out of place. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the metal floor. It was the same frequency that he had heard faintly earlier, the one he thought was nothing more than the typical sounds of an aircraft cruising through the sky. But now, it was louder. It felt unnatural. Holloway knelt down and placed his ear to the metal floor. The hum was unmistakable now, a high-pitched sound that vibrated in his chest. Olivia joined him moments later, her expression confused. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the strange noise. "I don't know," Holloway replied. He scanned the cargo hold again, this time looking for the source of the noise. His eyes fell upon a particular crate in the far corner of the hold, covered in dense foam padding. It was labeled with strange markings he hadn't noticed before, symbols he didn't recognize. He walked over to the crate and knelt down beside it. The hum was coming directly from inside it. "This is it," he said, his voice a mixture of realization and dread. He motioned for Olivia to step closer. Olivia hesitated but eventually crouched down beside him. Together, they pried open the crate, revealing an array of high-tech equipment. At first glance, it appeared to be scientific in nature: wires, devices, and small generators. But one piece stood out, a small black box that seemed to emit the high-pitched hum. As soon as they uncovered it, the noise grew louder. "What the hell is this?" Olivia muttered, her hands hovering over the device as if afraid to touch it. "I don't know," Holloway said, his voice low. "But whatever it is, it's causing the birds to go crazy. The signal, it's too strong for them to ignore." The realization hit both of them at once. The crows, drawn to this mysterious frequency, had become increasingly aggressive, sensing the device's vibrations. The device wasn't just emitting a sound, it was emitting a frequency that was interfering with the birds' navigation systems, their ability to communicate, and perhaps even their instincts. Olivia, We need to get this thing out of here. Now, Holloway ordered, his tone decisive. They both moved swiftly, lifting the device with caution. As they did, they noticed the birds outside the plane begin to falter, briefly breaking their focus as if the energy field around them had momentarily shifted. Holloway could feel the weight of the device in his hands. This was the source of the chaos. "We've got to land," Olivia said, her voice urgent. "If this thing can affect the birds, it could cause damage to the plane. We need to get rid of it before it's too late." Holloway nodded grimly. "We're landing immediately. Get back to the cockpit." The hum from the device grew louder as they made their way back to the cockpit, the crows outside the plane now dispersing. The device's frequency had started to affect the plane's systems in ways they hadn't anticipated. There was no time to waste. They needed to land, and fast. As Holloway and Olivia returned to the cockpit, the small, humming device they had removed from the cargo hold still pulsed in Holloway's hands. The sound was almost unbearable now, a shrill frequency that seemed to reverberate through every bone in his body. He placed the device carefully on the floor beside his seat and immediately turned his attention back to the controls. "Olivia, we need to figure out what this is. Whatever it is, it's the cause of the bird's behavior," Holloway said, his voice tight with urgency. "This wasn't some random event. This device is part of something bigger." Olivia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her focus to the window, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The crows were no longer circling the plane, no longer pounding against the fuselage. The air had suddenly gone eerily quiet. The usual drone of the engine and the hum of the airplane systems now seemed too loud, too sharp, compared to the unsettling silence outside. "They're gone," Olivia said, her voice filled with disbelief. "The birds, they're just gone, like they were called away." Holloway turned to look out the window. The sky was now clear, and there was no sign of the swarm. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air, leaving the plane in a bubble of stillness. For the first time since the chaos had begun, Holloway felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. But the relief was fleeting. He reached for the device again, picking it up and studying it with a critical eye. The humming had stopped, but there was something odd about it. The device appeared to be simple in structure, metallic, with a series of wires and coils embedded within. But there was a strange, intricate pattern etched into the surface, a design that seemed to pulse with some kind of energy. "What are you?" Holloway muttered under his breath as he ran his fingers over the markings. It was clear that this wasn't just some piece of malfunctioning equipment. This was something intentional, something that had been designed with purpose. And whatever that purpose was, it had set the birds into a frenzy, disrupting their natural instincts and forcing them to attack the plane. Olivia, who had been watching him closely, finally spoke. "Do you think this was some kind of weapon? Something designed to affect wildlife or the environment?" Holloway hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I don't think this is just about the birds. This is bigger than that. This device is too sophisticated to be some random experiment. Whoever made this, whatever it is they're trying to do, it's far beyond our understanding right now." The realization hung heavily in the air. They had unwittingly stumbled upon something far darker than a simple bird strike. But what was the purpose of this device? Was it just a freak accident, or had it been placed on the plane for some reason? And why did it affect the birds the way it did? Suddenly, a voice crackled through the radio, breaking the tense silence. "Flight 742, this is New York Center. We've been receiving unusual readings from your flight path. You're off course, and your radar systems are showing strange interference. Please confirm your current status. Holloway's eyes widened in alarm as he checked the navigation system. They had indeed veered off course, slightly, but enough to be concerning. The plane's systems had been interfered with ever since the birds began attacking, and it seemed that the device they had discovered was still affecting the plane's radar and communication systems. New York Center, this is Flight 742. We've experienced some unusual interference, but we're handling the situation. We need to land immediately, Holloway responded, his voice steady but filled with urgency. There's a malfunction on board. We're going to need emergency clearance. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the air traffic controller replied, their tone somber. Copy that, Flight 742. We're clearing you for an emergency landing. Stand by for instructions. As Holloway prepared to descend, Olivia's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a malfunction. Something about the device, its design, its strange humming frequency, felt deliberate. It wasn't just a piece of rogue equipment. It was a tool, perhaps part of a larger scheme, and they had unknowingly become its latest target. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft beep from the cockpit's secondary console. The screen flashed, displaying a set of coordinates. It was a set of random numbers at first glance, but as Olivia scanned them more carefully, she noticed something peculiar. The coordinates seemed to align with a remote, abandoned research facility on the outskirts of a nearby city, a location that hadn't been in use for years. That's strange, Olivia murmured. These coordinates, they're pointing to a location that shouldn't even be active. It's not on any of our flight plans, and it's not anywhere near our intended route. Holloway's brow furrowed as he leaned over to look at the screen. A research facility? Could it be connected to this device? I don't know, Olivia replied, her voice filled with concern. But it's too much of a coincidence. It's almost like the device was meant to lead us here. A growing sense of unease settled over them both. This wasn't just about a plane being attacked by crows. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Something that had been set in motion long before they had boarded this flight. We need to land as soon as possible, Holloway said, his voice firm. Once we're on the ground, we need to find out who put that device on this plane and why. But first, we need to make sure this thing doesn't do any more damage. With the plane descending toward the nearest airport, Holloway's thoughts turned to the future. He had no idea what they were walking into when they landed, but one thing was clear. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over. The unexpected discovery of the device, combined with the strange interference and the mysterious coordinates, had opened a door to something far more dangerous than a simple mechanical failure. As the plane touched down and began its descent onto the runway, Holloway and Olivia shared one final glance. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they both knew they had uncovered something they weren't meant to find, and they had no choice but to uncover the truth. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Holloway and Olivia remained in the cockpit, the weight of their discovery heavy on their minds. The strange, humming device that had caused the birds' violent behavior still sat on the floor beside Holloway's seat, its eerie silence now only making the tension in the air more palpable. The plane was still flying, but their thoughts were no longer on altitude or direction. They were consumed by what they had just uncovered. Olivia's fingers danced across the control panel, pressing buttons, checking systems, her mind running through possible scenarios. The radar was still affected by the device's interference, and the communication systems were unreliable, crackling with static. She couldn't shake the image of the birds crashing into the plane. Something had changed in the way they reacted. It wasn't just a simple animal instinct. It was as though they had been manipulated, their behavior altered by an external force. We need to land. Now, Holloway said, his voice firm as he stared at the navigational charts in front of him. His usually calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by an urgency he couldn't suppress. The strange coordinates they had discovered on the screen pointed to an abandoned research facility not far from their current location. The sheer coincidence of it was enough to send chills down his spine. The device was no random malfunction. Someone had intentionally placed it on the plane, and now they had to face the consequences. Olivia, the birds are gone, but this isn't over. We're not just dealing with some freak occurrence anymore. We need to figure out what's going on, and the longer we stay in the air, the more risk we're putting everyone on board in. Olivia nodded, already processing the gravity of the situation. I agree. The radar's still down. The interference is worsening, and we've got no clear communication with air traffic control. If something else happens, if the system goes down entirely, or if there's another malfunction, we could lose control. Holloway's fingers hovered over the controls, his gaze flicking between the systems and the window as if expecting another wave of crows to appear out of nowhere. But no, the skies were clear now, eerily so. The tension that had gripped the plane only moments earlier seemed to hang in the air, thick with uncertainty. The aircraft was flying on autopilot, but without reliable communication, they could be anywhere at any moment. The crows might have stopped, but the device was still active. And who knew what other systems it could disrupt if they continued to fly? We don't know if this device has triggered anything else on board, Holloway continued. We can't take any more chances. Olivia glanced out the window again. The horizon was dimming as the sun began to dip, and they were now flying into an area that was both unfamiliar and troubling. The coordinates they'd found on the navigation system still pointed to that strange research facility, an old, abandoned complex that hadn't been operational for years. It wasn't on their flight plan. It wasn't even on the usual flight paths that commercial aircraft followed. It was isolated, remote, and they were getting dangerously close. I'm getting a bad feeling about this, Holloway. We're too close to that place. What if this whole thing is connected to that research facility? Olivia asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. Holloway's hand tightened around the controls. That's exactly why we need to land. Whatever is going on, we need to stay grounded. If that place is where the device came from, or worse, if that's where it's supposed to lead us, then the sooner we're on the ground, the better. The decision was made. They had no other option. Flight 742, this is New York Center, crackled a voice through the radio, its tone strained. We've been unable to get a solid fix on your position. You're off course. Please confirm your location and intentions. Holloway pressed the microphone button, his voice steady despite the growing urgency. New York Center, this is Captain Holloway. We are requesting an emergency landing. Our systems are malfunctioning, and we need clearance immediately. There was a brief pause on the other end. Flight 742, we're clearing you for an emergency landing. Please follow the emergency vector to the nearest airport. Coordinates confirmed. Landing clearance granted. Over. Holloway exhaled slowly, his heart pounding as he checked the flight path once more. It would be a rough landing, but it was the only option. He had no idea what they were walking into on the ground, but they couldn't remain airborne any longer. Not with the device still aboard, not with the unpredictable nature of the interference, and certainly not with the growing sense that something far more sinister was unfolding around them. Olivia, get ready for the descent. We're landing, Holloway said, as he initiated the process to bring the plane down. His hands moved with the practiced ease of an experienced pilot, but underneath the confidence, there was an undercurrent of dread. This wasn't a simple emergency landing. This wasn't just about getting safely to the ground. As the plane began its descent, Holloway's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the device. He had to know more about it. Had it been placed on the plane deliberately? Was it some kind of experiment? Or was it part of a larger operation? The bird's strange behavior had led them to the discovery of something much more dangerous than a simple mechanical failure. And now, the crash course to the ground seemed like the only way to stop the escalating disaster. "Captain, the runway's ahead. We've got clearance," Olivia said, her voice calm but tinged with concern. She checked the systems again. Everything seemed stable enough, but the interference from the device still lingered in the background. Whatever had caused this disturbance wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cockpit filled with the whirring sound of the landing gear lowering, and the runway lights appeared on the horizon, casting an eerie glow against the darkening sky. The weight of the decision to land settled heavily in Holloway's chest, but he knew it was the only choice. No matter the unknowns waiting for them on the ground, the risk of staying airborne was far too great. As the plane neared the runway, Holloway's grip tightened on the controls. He glanced once more at the humming device sitting on the floor beside him. He could feel the subtle vibrations of its presence, as if it was still reaching out, pulling at the fabric of the plane's systems, coaxing the disruption to continue. The wheels touched down with a jolt, the plane bouncing slightly as it hit the runway. Holloway quickly reined in the descent, his focus sharp. They were on the ground now, but the danger wasn't over. Whatever awaited them at the research facility, whatever had been set into motion with the device, was still out there. And the real work was just beginning. The plane had touched down smoothly on the runway, its tires screeching against the pavement as Holloway guided it to a stop. The engines gradually wound down, the hum of the aircraft slowly diminishing. Outside, the emergency lights on the tarmac illuminated the scene, casting an eerie red glow across the darkened sky. The sudden stillness that followed was almost as unsettling as the chaos they had just experienced. Captain Holloway's hands remained steady on the controls as he glanced out of the cockpit window. The runway lights flickered in the distance, but there was a sense of relief in the air. Relief that, for now, the immediate danger had passed. But Holloway knew that relief was fleeting. The real question now was what had happened. What was the device? What was its purpose? And perhaps most pressing of all, who was behind it? "Olivia," Holloway said quietly, turning his gaze away from the window and to his co-pilot. She had already removed her headset, her expression a mix of exhaustion and concern. "We're on the ground, but we still don't have answers. That device, it wasn't just some freak accident. Someone placed it on this plane for a reason." Olivia nodded, her eyes flicking to the device still sitting in the corner of the cockpit, its metallic surface gleaming ominously in the dim light. "I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over." The bird stopped, the device stopped humming, but something bigger is at play here. That facility we saw in the coordinates, it can't be a coincidence. "Exactly," Holloway agreed, his jaw clenched. "We're not dealing with a simple malfunction. We need to get to the bottom of this, and I have a feeling it's all connected to that research facility." With the plane safely on the ground and emergency crews approaching, Holloway and Olivia were both aware that they had no choice but to take the next step. They had landed at a small regional airport on the outskirts of a city, one that was far from any major metropolitan area. The location was quiet, isolated, and it felt far removed from the chaos they had just escaped. Once the plane was parked, the emergency crew quickly surrounded it, their vehicles flashing in the dark night. The flight attendants began to usher the passengers off the plane, some still visibly shaken by the strange events they had witnessed. Holloway and Olivia remained in the cockpit for a moment longer, both silent, both lost in thought. "We need to tell the authorities what happened," Olivia said, her voice breaking the silence. "But I don't think anyone is going to believe us unless we have something concrete. We need to find out who put that device on board and why." Holloway exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "I know. We'll need to check the flight records, see if there's any trace of it being loaded onto the plane. We'll also need to speak to the airport staff, see if anyone saw anything unusual." Just as they began to unbuckle their seatbelts, there was a knock on the cockpit door. Holloway opened it to reveal a tall man in a dark suit, a local law enforcement officer. His face was serious, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "We've been briefed on the situation, Captain. We need you and your co-pilot to come with us," the officer said, his tone polite but firm. "There's a lot to discuss, and we've already alerted federal authorities. You'll need to make a statement about what happened." Holloway exchanged a glance with Olivia. They knew this was just the beginning. The authorities would have questions, and they would want answers. But Holloway also knew that this wouldn't be the end of their involvement. Whoever was behind the device, whoever had orchestrated the disturbance with the crows, would not stop just because they had landed the plane. In fact, it was more likely that this was only the beginning of a much larger scheme. The officer led them off the plane, guiding them toward a set of waiting vehicles. The airport was eerily quiet now, with only the occasional rustling of wind breaking the silence. As they walked toward the cars, Holloway looked over his shoulder at the plane one last time, feeling an odd sense of finality. It had been a harrowing flight, but they had made it. Olivia broke the silence once more, her voice low. "Do you think this has anything to do with that facility we found? What if it's connected to whatever this device is?" Holloway nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. "I think you're right. I don't think this is just about birds or a malfunctioning device. I think it's about control, manipulating things, influencing them, and we've only scratched the surface." The vehicle they were in soon arrived at the local police station, where they were met by several officers. Holloway and Olivia were ushered into an interrogation room, where they were seated at a long, sterile table. The officer from earlier entered the room and took a seat across from them. "Now, let's go over everything," the officer began. "You said you discovered a device on the plane that was causing interference. What exactly did you find?" Holloway took a deep breath, trying to recall every detail of what had happened. It wasn't just a piece of equipment malfunctioning. It was a small metallic device. It emitted a frequency, a hum. "We believe it was controlling the behavior of the birds. They weren't attacking randomly. They were reacting to something that had been placed on the plane." The officer nodded, making notes as Holloway spoke. "And the research facility you mentioned?" Olivia leaned forward. "It was strange. The coordinates that appeared on the system pointed to an abandoned facility. It hasn't been in use for years, but it's possible that it's still connected to whatever operation this device is part of." The officer's pen paused over his notebook. "We'll look into that. But for now, we need to know if there's anything else you two found on the plane. Any clues that might help us track down who's behind this?" Holloway exchanged a look with Olivia, then nodded. "We'll cooperate fully, but I think we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we realize." Hours passed as the authorities began their investigation, but the answers were slow in coming. The device was removed from the plane for further analysis, and Holloway and Olivia were questioned extensively. But no one could explain who had placed the device there or what its ultimate goal was. The research facility remained an enigma, and the more the authorities dug, the more questions emerged without clear answers. As they sat in the small holding room, Holloway felt the weight of the events pressing down on him. The birds, the device, the disturbance. It had all been too strange, too orchestrated, to be a mere coincidence. But the final truth still eluded them. Who was behind this? What had they hoped to achieve? And what would happen next? As the first light of dawn broke through the window, casting a pale glow across the room, Holloway realized that they had only just uncovered a fraction of the truth. The mystery wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And for Holloway and Olivia, the journey to uncover the full story would be one that would change everything they thought they knew about the world. The end, or perhaps just the beginning.